I've got a riddle for you. What's large and rectangular, rides on approximately 10 wheels, holds something like 100 passengers, and is propelled by a diesel engine? Okay, the answer to this question is very simple. It's a train. No, seriously, it's a train. You see, even Amtrak thinks so, or at least thought so. All joking aside, as you can probably guess, the topic for this particular video is going to be Amtrak's bustitute. And for those of you not familiar with Amtrak lingo, a bustitute is a situation in which Amtrak substitutes a bus for an actual train. In my case, my bustitution would occur along the Lakeshore Limited route, specifically the Boston section, between Boston's South Station, located in Boston, Massachusetts, and Albany Rensselaer Station, located in Albany, New York. Now, for those of you not familiar with my channel, I do encourage you to subscribe, of course. You note that one of my more recent videos has me taking a route to avoid the bustitute, effectively having to travel all the way down to New York City, and then via the Northeast Corridor back up to Boston, effectively adding somewhere around 2 to 3, and in some cases 4 hours to my trip. As it turned out, however, and every attempt I've made since then, this maneuver actually took longer than it was supposed to, with constant delays and other problems causing me to either miss trains and or causing the connecting train to run extremely late, thus delaying me even longer. The more concerning one was the most recent trip I did to Boston before this one, where I was delayed to the point where I didn't arrive home until after 1 o'clock in the morning, roughly 1:30, not acceptable at all. And so while I would reroute my northbound trip up to Boston via the Northeast Corridor this time, I decided to simply leave the bustitute in place as it was for the return southbound trip back to Albany Rensselaer. After all, if there was an issue with getting a connection out of Albany, it would not be a big deal to get a ride from that point than it would be, of course, if I got stuck in New York City, which would force me to wait for the next train if I could get on it, which was something I did not want to risk again considering how late I had been in the past. As I implied before, 2 days before this particular time, I had taken the Hudson line down to New York City, and once again, like I had done previously, connected with a Boston-bound Northeast Corridor train, in this case a regional, to get up to Boston. There were a few delays in this particular part of the trip, and I will note them in a later video that I'm planning to make. The next day I'd spent Railfanning Reedville, where I got some great catches, specifically that of CSX, which made quite a few appearances on that day. In addition, the weather couldn't have been better. While it was a bit on the overcast side, there was still plenty of light to take trains, of course, and while I did have a few light showers, temperatures, unlike the previous day where they were nearly 100 degrees, barely got above 70. For the most part, a beautiful day railfanning with almost perfect weather, and essentially my luck held out for the most part, although I did miss 1 or 2 trains due to my lack of patience and an unfortunate need to go to the bathroom. Incidentally, those of you railfanning Reedville who are looking for a place to go, there's a Dunkin' Donuts located pretty much next door, which I also bought myself a light luncheon. Railfanning went so well that I foregoed my trip to the hobby shop, usually Charles Rose Supply or Northeast Trains, as I was just getting too many beautiful shots, including this shot of the Avalia Liberty set actually sitting in Boston South Station, which apparently had just come back from completing a test run. Please note that these sets, at least at the time I'm making this video, are still not in regular service, at least on the Northeast Corridor. Upon arriving back at my hotel, and mainly due to my unusual hours, I pretty much passed out, and slept until sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning. Again, I usually work nights, so being awake during the day is kind of alien to me. And due to the massive crowds on the trains I took to get actually to Boston before this point, I never actually got any sleep on the way up. That said, I would pay the price for going to sleep early, as my logic being I would just simply sleep on the way home on the bus, which simply wouldn't work. More on this later. The next day, after a bowl of cereal, I promptly headed out to Charles Rose Supply to do some of the train shopping I had neglected to get to the day before due to how well things were working out, ironically enough. After picking up some supplies, including one very lovely looking locomotive I just had to have, I promptly got myself a ride back to my hotel, which I in turn arrived a little late on due to the extreme traffic that's been occurring in Boston since the massive road construction projects have begun, which have been further aggravated due to problems with the MBTA's transit system, better known as the T, which operates a combination of trolleys and subway lines, as well as buses. As I've mentioned previously, I'm not a fan of taking buses. It's not that I have a fear of traveling over the road, in fact, far from it. As a child, even from the earliest ages, I would often accompany my parents on their weekly jaunts to upstate New York to stay at our vacation home, even if it wasn't ski season, just for the sake of getting away from the city. Riding in a car actually used to put me to sleep much better than anything else did. And at the same time, I also began to develop a passion for cars, which became my second interest behind trains, although they were admittedly before I got my first train set at a slightly older age. My main concern, I'm one of those many Americans who apparently suffer from motion sickness/seasickness, especially on bouncy buses. To make matters worse and further aggravating this was the fact that my rideshare trip up to Charles Road just before the point of departure had in fact done a number on my stomach due to a very rough ride, partly due to the conditions of the road and the traffic conditions at that time. Upon arriving around noon for my bus that was in fact a train that was in fact a bus, if you will, I promptly decided to see if I could cure this by getting an extra order of white rice with my chicken and broccoli, which I had bought from the Chinese food eatery that was set up in South Station's food court. At some point just over or under a half an hour, an announcement was made that all those taking the bus to Albany Rensselaer needed to meet at the blue Amtrak information counter. There was soon a massive gathering of people at this particular location. I'm happy to report that Amtrak did successfully and several times report over and over again to myself as well as the other passengers that we were in fact taking a bus, and all the passengers knew that they were in fact getting on a bus, unlike the previous attempt where many passengers didn't know what was happening and somehow still thought they were getting on a train, this delaying the bus's departure as apparently several announcements had to be made and several of the passengers that were still in the waiting room had to be guided toward the bus, as they still had no idea where they were going due to the bad information being passed on the Amtrak app as well as the website. I took this opportunity to make one last stop at the restroom to make sure that my stomach would be in the best shape as possible for this trip. Finally, after waiting roughly 10 to 15 minutes, we were escorted outside the actual station itself to the buses, which were parked around the corner from South Station. And that is right, you did hear me say plural, buses. Amtrak had made a rather clever move here. All of the passengers that were not traveling all the way to Albany on the Lakeshore Limited were put onto the local bus. While these passengers might need to make other connections along the way, including to the Downeaster and one or two other New Haven-bound trains, they would not need to go all the way to Albany. This would take the stress off that particular driver as well as the passengers in general. Myself and the rest of the passengers that were going all the way from Boston South Station to Albany Rensselaer Station were then put on the, quote, express bus that would run directly from South Station all the way to Albany Rensselaer, effectively door to door. And so, doing the best to keep my nervous stomach in the back of my mind, I promptly made my way over to the express bus, dropped off my rolling bag to be placed inside the cargo hold located beneath the bus as there would be little space on board, and made my way aboard the bus. Now, I began to get a little relief immediately from this point. I'd initially heard horror stories about Amtrak having to charter buses at the last second, some of which were in excess of 30 years old with leaky roofs and no amenities, not even air conditioning in some cases, or a restroom that was so filthy that it wasn't even utilizable. To my unbounded relief, I found that the bus that we were actually on was run by a high-end tour operator and was in fact an almost brand new Mercedes-Benz built coach. Upon boarding the bus and climbing the stairs, myself and my fellow passengers were immediately ordered to the back of the bus to fill in all available seats. I soon began to realize there were going to be two issues with this. First off, the seats in the back of the bus had absolutely no leg room at all, and no, I'm not joking as we see from these shots. The second notation here is that the seats in the back of the bus would be riding directly over the rear wheels or around that area, away from the center of balance, meaning a much more bouncy ride. Again, remember my nervous stomach? There was no way in hell that was going to work. Quickly realizing this wasn't going to work for me, I promptly found a seat toward the middle of the bus, which I promptly took. Upon sitting down, I did notice this bus was designed to be high-end and was pretty comfortable in terms of its seating. The seats were capable of reclining, although I could never tell exactly what the limit of the recline was, due to the fact that the bus had been configured to carry 2 passengers requiring wheelchairs. And in turn to accommodate this, the seat behind myself and my seatmate had to both be pushed right against ours to accommodate the wheelchair space on that side of the bus. There were some bizarre underlying issues that prevented my ride from being far more comfortable than it actually was. To start with, while there was a leg rest, there was no room for it. Why? Because there was almost no leg room. There were tray tables provided, but these were extremely small, to the point where my 11-inch 2-in-1 would not fit on it correctly at all. I ended up having to put it in viewing mode and actually hang on to it with one hand to prevent it from sliding off. Nonetheless, I did make this work. Two plugs were provided on the floor as well as some USB ports, which I promptly connected my multi-USB plug adapter, which is capable of both powering my laptop and my cell phone as well as my camera if need be. There did appear to be a Wi-Fi hotspot on board. However, no instructions were ever given to us as to how to utilize the Wi-Fi on board the bus, and so this remained inaccessible to most passengers. In this case, this didn't matter much, as we would have excellent cell phone service along the route as we were on a major highway. The seat, while ergonomically correct for the most part, was simply too short for me, not to mention narrow, as I struggled to fit into it with my wide 6.5-foot frame, and the headrest was not adjustable, further aggravating the comfort situation. Thus, I would not be able to get any sleep on this particular ride. Although, and unfortunately so, my stomach would play a key role in this part as well, more on this later. About 10 or 15 minutes after our scheduled departure time, we finally left South Station, bound for Albany Rensselaer. The delay once again being caused by passengers getting on the wrong bus, or in some cases not realizing that they were getting on a bus, not a train. Although in this case this appeared to be down to passengers that weren't paying attention to what they were booking, having purchased their tickets on the app. As is typical with any ride through Boston, Massachusetts, the trip through the city took forever, as we constantly got stopped with traffic jams. This was despite the fact that this trip was taking place on off hours, long before that of rush hour. And unfortunately, this would continue even after we left the city limits, with the mass turnpike crowded on this Friday afternoon, with many motorists on early summer weekend getaways. This had a noticeable effect on our progress. For example, it took roughly a half an hour longer than the MBTA does, even with its delays and other such issues, for us to reach Worcester, Massachusetts from our starting point in Boston. With no work to do and not much to see outside the window, I entertained myself by watching some old TV shows, which I had very smartly downloaded before I left on this trip to ensure I would have access to some sort of entertainment if the Wi-Fi didn't work, and knowing how spotty the Wi-Fi can be between Albany, Rensselaer, and Boston, Massachusetts. One thing that I will keep in mind again if I end up doing another one of these trips is to not utilize my 2-in-1 laptop, but rather my handheld gaming device, as inside the dock I'm sure that device would have taken up less space and been more practical for these tiny tray tables. The highly frustrating part was that I actually had one of these with me, but I had kept it in my main bag, thinking it would be unnecessary for this trip, as I thought again I would simply sleep through the whole trip, which of course wasn't going to happen. Despite my position on the bus, my stomach still wasn't playing nice, and I began to realize I was in big trouble and needed to use a restroom and quick. And so I made my way to the back of the bus, where I did find, to my unbounded relief, that the restroom was in perfect shape. Again, this bus appeared to be almost new, if not completely brand new. Now, while this restroom was in perfect shape, it was not the most equipped restroom one would find, as there was no facility to wash your hands, just hand sanitizer, although the flushing system on the toilet seemed to be much more modern than I was used to on buses. And thank goodness there was plenty of toilet paper. Upon returning to my seat, I felt much better and was able to spend the rest of the trip in relative comfort, although again not enough to fall asleep. As the trip moved on, we continued to hit traffic jam after traffic jam and bump after bump. The bumps being due to the stellar condition the Massachusetts Turnpike is in. And by stellar, of course, I actually mean horrific, forcing me to keep an ever tighter grip on my 2-in-1 so it didn't get any ideas about falling on the floor. And so anyone traveling on this bus, including myself, who may have complained in the past about delays on Amtrak, as well as how rough the tracks can be in some areas, which admittedly is true, are given a very thorough reminder as the fact that there is still a huge difference between taking Amtrak and taking the bus. I kept an eye on the large digital clock located toward the front of the bus and mounted up high so everyone could see it, as the minutes agonizingly ticked away. Finally, several episodes of Law & Order and Batman Beyond later, the time had finally reached 4 o'clock. Now, I had assumed, especially considering all the delays, that despite the fact we were running express, we would probably not get in much earlier than 6 o'clock. Although I did note that even Amtrak managed to shake this schedule by 1 hour a lot of times. And so, just for giggles, I pulled out my cell phone and pulled up Google Maps, and was pretty stunned to find that I found some very familiar names showing up, including the town of East Greenbush, as well as several smaller as well as larger businesses set up in our area, all with the subnames Capital Region, which for those of you out there who are not familiar with the Northeast region of the United States, this subname indicates that the business/location is located somewhere near or around Albany. Sure enough, after I asked my GPS for directions via car, it indicated we were a mere 14 minutes away from Albany Rensselaer. Excited and ecstatic, I promptly contacted my father and let him know the good news. And sure enough, within 14 minutes, we pulled into Albany Rensselaer Station, although the back area by the loading dock area. Upon arriving, one of the Amtrak crew members, who again were taking this bus to meet up with the train, that being the Lakeshore Limited Chicago section, which was coming up from New York, informed the passengers where the elevator was, as well as the fact that there was a cafe located on the top floor where we could grab something to eat if we wanted. Again, no food was provided on the bus, nor was made for sale. He then thanked us for riding with Amtrak and proceeded to direct us to leave the bus via the front exit. Stiff from the somewhat long and somewhat uncomfortable trip, I took my time getting up from my seat, making sure to gather all of my personal belongings. I would in fact be one of the last passengers to leave the bus. This would cost me dearly, however, as I would just miss my last chance to book a train running out of Albany Rensselaer to Hudson, New York. In the end, my father came up to Albany to meet me and basically took me home from there. And so, in conclusion, what did I think of Amtrak's bustitute? Well, it wasn't nearly as horrific as I had heard, with many a passenger being forced to endure a bustitution telling horror stories of prehistoric buses that really shouldn't have been on the road, with leaky roofs, lack of air conditioning, and being filthy to the point where they were completely unsanitary. Again, while my trip was rough and a little bit cramped, it wasn't nearly as bad as that. All this said, though, I still prefer the train, but I guess if I had to, I would not mind taking the bus again, especially if it got me into my destination a little bit sooner. And that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please like, subscribe, and comment. And as always, keep the metal side down.